So welcome to our webinar. My name is Duran, and we are now recording in both English and Spanish. Some of you may be interested in listening to this webinar in Spanish. And for those of you who are, I'm now going to give you instructions in Spanish on how to access the Spanish recording. Bienvenidos. Tenemos interpretación en español disponible. Para seleccionar su idioma, si está usando un dispositivo móvil, por favor, toque su pantalla, seleccione los tres puntos, seleccione interpretación de idiomas, seleccione español, seleccione silenciar el audio original y para finalizar su opción, por favor, seleccione finalizado o listo. Si está utilizando una computadora, verá un globo ubicado en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Por favor, haga clic en el globo, seleccione español, luego seleccione silenciar el audio original. Gracias. So thank you all. For those of you who don't speak Spanish, I told you how to access the Spanish language interpretation. You can listen to this webinar in English or Spanish, and we will make both of those recordings available after this webinar. You'll receive a link with all the information on how to do that. I just want to say a few things before we launch, and I'm just going to show a quick share screen in order to start our webinar here. Here we go. And this webinar is on extreme heat, protecting public health and the economy in California's Central Valley. It's presented by the Climate Center. We're a California policy-oriented nonprofit that works throughout the state to promote equitable, accelerated climate action. This particular topic of extreme heat, I think, is notable, especially as we've got these extremely warm days here in May, and we're thinking forward towards the hot season that's still coming, and all of us are concerned about this issue and how to address it. We have some great speakers here to talk about that. So I just need to go to my, so thank you all for that. I would like to recognize, first of all, here we go. Sorry, I apologize. I'm having a slight technical issue. Today's webinar is on extreme heat. We also want to make sure you all know that we have another webinar coming up next week on June 8th on investing in building electrification for a climate safe future. We'll drop the link to that webinar into the chat here in just a moment so you can register. I also want to take a moment to thank all of our webinar sponsors. It would not be possible for us to be here were it not for the kindness and generosity of all of these businesses and organizations that help support the Climate Center and our webinar program. So thank you to River City Bank, Y-Green, Summit State Bank, Silicon Valley Clean Energy, the LA Department of Water and Power, Terra Verde, Blue Planet Energy, MCE, Bayer Air Quality Management District, and Peninsula Clean Energy. These organizations from throughout California give you a sense of the breadth of the coalition that we're building on behalf of Climate Safe California. Another indication of that is our promotional partners from all over the state: Joint Venture Silicon Valley, the Clean Coalition, Better World Group, Civic Well, Community Environmental Council, Climate Resolve, Center for Sustainable Energy, Acterra, Move LA, Drawdown Bay Area, the Monterey Bay Economic Partnership, and California Environmental Voters. All these organizations support the work that we're doing as we do theirs, and we're proud to work with them in coalition in support of a climate safe future. So thank you once again for coming to our webinar, Extreme Heat, Protecting Public Health and the Economy in California's Central Valley. I'm going to stop my screen share now, and I just want to point out that we will have a couple of speakers and then a Q&A session, and then our last two speakers and our final Q&A session. If you have questions for our speakers, you can use the chat, but we encourage you to use the Q&A portal. We will be gathering those questions and organizing it on behalf of the ones that are most commonly asked, and try and get as many of those questions in as possible during our two Q&A portions. So please do engage with us. Send us your questions through the Q&A, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So I want to thank everybody for joining us once again. And in order to set our context and in preparation for our first speaker, Dr. Jose Pablo Ortiz Partida, I'd like to first bring in my colleague, Mark Victoria. Mark, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Victoria, and I'm the senior statewide organizer with the Climate Center. And I just wanted to go ahead and run through a little bit of a presentation regarding our Climate Safe California campaign. So let me go ahead and start my screen share. And I hope you all can see this now.
Yes.
Perfect. Yep. So Climate Safe California is a campaign that the Climate Center has put together to urge our legislators and our governor to take bold action on climate. As we are all aware, we are in what is called a code red moment for humanity. We are having multiple issues around the world. It seems to be hitting the news wires. It's not even every day anymore. It's every few hours we're getting something different, some type of environmental disaster, humanity disaster, and we're now seeing the effects of climate change, not only just as it affects us outside, but it's also starting to affect our food supplies. But not only externally, not only around the globe, but we're facing and have been facing this for a very long time in California. We are in the middle of a 20-year drought, and that has been the worst drought that we have had in over a millennia. We are regularly facing, our fire season has expanded to be basically throughout the entire year. No longer is it a season. We are having red smoke days up in the Bay Area and in Southern California. We have had always to deal with extreme smoke. The Central Valley, of course, is at the worst of it all, not only for the heat, but the way that the smoke is trapped up into the Central Valley. And this is all a new normal for us. We are, as I said before, our fire season is no longer a season. It goes on throughout the entire year. The drought is affecting us horribly, and we're seeing our reservoirs drop more and more every year. California used to be a leader for climate change around the globe, but is no longer. California has now fallen behind. Many other states and many other countries around the world are moving ahead of us in setting more aggressive and more bold policies to be able to cut greenhouse gases to levels that are far below where we are today. And what we have seen, at least in the state, is that bold targets do work. When our legislators, not only our legislators, but the governor, but also the folks that are lobbying up there and advocating for better climate, when everybody is working together, we're seeing these types of legislation and policies come together to actually change what our future will hold. But of course, we know what is standing in our way, and it's our oil and gas interests that are standing in our way and blocking legislators from making the right decisions and taking the right votes to be able to secure a climate safe California. And so Climate Safe California is our push for California to ensure that we are moving towards a net negative greenhouse gas emission by 2030. Global goals are set at 2045. Our governor had said, no, we want to move that to 2035. And the Climate Center, along with its allies, wanted to move that even further to 2030. Why are we moving it to 2030? Because we know that the only way that California survives is by having these thriving and healthy communities. We need to create new jobs in the energy sector and replace old jobs in fossil fuel industries. Our guiding principles that take us through this are to, one, follow the latest science. We need to secure a just transition for fossil fuel workers, their families, and the communities that depend on those industries. We also need to prioritize climate justice with equitable access to climate solutions so that everyone in California, not just those that can afford to live in areas that aren't affected by greenhouse gas emissions or by climate change, so that everybody is secure in their future. So we need to look at phasing out fossil fuels, scaling up our natural carbon removal and not depend on just the technical aspects of carbon removal, which has proven to be significantly less effective. We need to invest in resiliency for communities for all, and we need to fund climate action now as well. California must be a leader. and hoping that in the 5th largest economy, that we will be able to push California ahead. And so we wanted to be able to put this webinar together to be able to highlight one of the issues that California, but more importantly, Californians are facing. And so with this, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and hand it back to Drought.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated, Mark. And Climate Safe California is an incredible policy platform that has over 1,600 endorsements, including Congress people, senators, assembly members from the state of California, academics, climate scientists, and others. If you'd like to join those folks in endorsing Climate Safe California, we have dropped a link in the chat. We encourage you to click on that and join those 1,600 folks who are calling for bold, accelerated, equitable climate action. And in order to frame our conversation today, I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Pablo Partida. Pablo, thank you so much for being here. We'd love to hear your thoughts on extreme heat in the Central Valley and how it connects to climate change. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And so I will be talking about extreme heat and how it is changing with climate change. Because as we will be seeing through the presentations today of the many challenges that farm workers and other workers face, extreme heat is among the most dangerous. And also today I want to do something different and start with my reasons for hope. This is something that I haven't done before. But I wanted to start with my reasons for hope because despite what I'm going to share today, I want you to know that I'm hopeful and that I believe there is a strong movement for equity and justice. And if you are here today, you are probably part of that movement. So thank you. In my case, my reasons for hope are people like you, people interested enough to be here. I also get a lot of hope from my family, from my partner, from my friends, from my colleagues, from the youth with hunger for change, and the many community leaders on the front lines of climate change fighting for equity. And now I invite you to think about your reasons for hope too. And while I go through the presentation, think about how extreme heat may affect some of these reasons for hope for you and what can you do to help. It's been 45 years since our planet had a cooler than average year. 2020 tied with 2016 as the hottest year on record, and last year, 2021, was the 6th hottest year on record. Even with all climate change, farm workers carry nearly 35 times the risk of heat-related deaths than the average worker in the United States. And these conditions are only getting worse with climate change. With climate change, the frequency and intensity of extreme heat is expected to increase. And in 2019, some of my colleagues published the Killer Heat Report, in which they found that between now and mid-century, the number of days with heat index above 100 degrees would double, and the number of days above 105 would quadruple if we fail to take action to reduce heat-trapping gas emissions. So narrowing that to California, Central Valley. So let's focus on California for a moment. And historically, the Central Valley counties have averaged about 45 days here, 45 days per year with a heat index above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat index is just a combination of temperature and relative humidity, and it's a closer number on how the temperature feels like. So historically, 45 days per year with a heat index above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and above 6 days per year above 100 degrees. Meanwhile, non-Central Valley counties have averaged about 22 days per year above 90 and 4 days per year with a heat index above 100 degrees. So what this means is that on average, outdoor workers in the Central Valley experience more days of extreme heat each year than the average worker elsewhere in California. And climate change is worsening heat exposure for the Central Valley outdoor workers. So within 30 years, the Central Valley could experience more than 30 days per year with a heat index above 100 degrees Fahrenheit here. And meaning this means about 1 month worth of days per year of such conditions. And areas such as Bakersfield, Fresno, and Merced are already entering into that reality. Last year, 2021, Merced experienced 17 days with maximum temperatures equal or above 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Bakersfield had 27 of such days, and Fresno had 36. And again, 36 days last year, Fresno, with maximum temperatures reaching or going above 104 degrees. Now, another aspect of extreme heat that is often overlooked is warm nights. And warm nights between April and October are also projected to increase from historically 3 to 5 nights to about 16 to 30 nights within the next 30 years. And warm nights may decrease sleep quality and sleeping time, and this leads to long-term conditions such as increased fatigue, bad mood, concentration issues, increased anxiety, and lower immune system. Warm nights disproportionately affect low-income and disadvantaged communities that don't have either air conditioners or the means to pay for the higher electricity bills. And then the impacts from warm nights exacerbates when poor air quality prevents opening windows, which is very common in the valley and is becoming even more common as we have more wildfires. And as you can imagine, beyond the impacts on people, heat also has the effects on our water resources. As temperatures increase, the ratio of precipitation falling as rain versus snow is increasing. The heat melts our snowpack earlier, and the higher temperatures makes the air thirstier, and this increases evapotranspiration. So all of these effects together with, from my perspective, a terrible history of unsustainable water management in the state are connected to recurrent drought. And I wanted to spend a couple of slides talking about this drought. So if you read the news, you probably saw some of these headlines a couple of months ago. And a study from UCLA and Columbia University found that the last 22 years have been the driest 22-year period in the Western United States in at least the last 1,200 years. And it says at least because that's how far the reconstructed data goes. So it could actually be worse. This dry period since the year 2000 is considered a mega drought, a dry period lasting in the order of decades. And another highlight of the study is the role of climate change in this current mega drought. Without climate change, we would still be having a drought, but according to the study, its severity will have been about 60% of what it is. So in other words, climate change is responsible for about 40% of the intensity of the current drought or of the current mega drought in which we are in California, actually in the whole Western United States. So this graph shows drought conditions in the Western United States during those 22 years. And despite some wet years like 2005, 2010, 2017, soils have been unable to recover from a soil moisture deficit since the year 2000. And as you can see in this graph, dry periods are coming at a rate that doesn't allow us to recover, and we are becoming more vulnerable and less resilient against droughts. Specifically for California, here is where we are now. In terms of drought conditions, from my perspective, we are worse than last year. This is the first year of drought. It was coming in. 2 years ago in May 2022. Then last year, May 2021. And this is a few days ago, May 24th of 2022. So while these maps could look like we are slightly better, they don't show the reservoir levels. How are our water reservoirs in California? And basically every major reservoir for water supply in California is below the historic average for this time of the year. And there is just not going to be enough snow in the mountains to melt during spring and summer and refill some of these reservoirs. Some of the takeaways is like failing to take action to reduce emissions would lead to a staggering expansion of dangerous heat. And also that aggressively reducing emissions could contain that expansion. So the more we do to reduce emissions, the less impacts we are going to see, not only for extreme heat, but for many of the other impacts related to climate change. And the time to act is now. And by now, maybe some of you are wondering, like, what can you do? So first of all, talk about it, help to spread the word. The more people knows about this, the higher is to hide, and the more people will feel motivated to get involved. And also advocate for climate change action and climate justice. And there are many ways to do this, but here are two simple ones. If money is an issue, then you can do something really simple, like becoming part of the newsletters of organizations that fight for equity and justice. And often these organizations share ways to get involved because they write letters to the governor or representatives of other agencies. And then by receiving these newsletters, you can sign onto these letters to show support. And if money is less of an issue, then here are some of my favorite groups to donate, which is the Union of Concerned Scientists, is where I work on, the Climate Center, which provides these sorts of events. And other great organizations are Community Water Center, Self-Help Enterprises, the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, Green Latinos, Water Education for Latino Leaders, and For Venir, which is this educational nonprofit funded by UC Mercedes students. And lastly, think about the ways equity can be integrated into your own work. Ask yourself if what you are doing is helping to reduce the equity gap, because if it's not, it's probably making it bigger. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pablo. I very much appreciate you blending reality and hopefulness. I think that's very important in the face of these huge problems for us to not lose track of the fact that we can and should be doing more. And thank you for giving people some specific things that they can focus on in their personal and professional lives. Very important. As we want to continue to move through this, I'd like to bring Irene Kalimlim into the conversation. Irene represents Little Manila Rising. Irene, I'll let you talk a little bit about that. And thank you for sharing your screen. Please I'm encouraging everyone to drop questions into the Q&A as we go. We'll be doing a Q&A session with Pablo and Irene right after this presentation. Irene, the floor is yours.
Is audio okay? And then the slides are viewable right now, right? Okay, great. So yes, thank you. My name is Irene. I'm with Little Manila Rising in Stockton, California. And my presentation will be talking about extreme heat and its impact on the community. And on this slide, the first picture is actually of me at the age of 8, standing in front of my home in the Little Manila neighborhood in South Stockton. And
Irene, I'm not seeing your slides at the moment. I'm not sure if there you go.
Right.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay. Now you're able to see it. Let me,
yes.
Can I just try again? I think I did it the wrong way.
No problem.
Okay. So stop share. Share screen. Is that showing the slides now?
No, it says.
Okay. Okay.
There you go.
Okay, I'll just do it this way. All right, sorry about that. So yeah, so this is a picture of me at the age of 8, growing up in the Little Manila neighborhood in South Stockton. Around this year, I was at a summer program at a community center, and was playing. It was an extremely hot day of July 1999, and it was a high of 102. And eventually, the community center had to call my mom because I had collapsed by a tree. And when she came and picked me up and took me to the doctor, they had identified that I had a heat stroke. And then after that, I spent the next few days, I think up to a week, just to my recollection, just trying to sleep off and recover from it. So now I want to go to focus on the second picture and talking about the neighborhood. Just from this bird's eye view, you can see that there's a lot of gray asphalt, not a lot of green in the picture. To the north, the Crosstown Freeway, to the south, the Amtrak train station, and just off to the left that you aren't able to see is the Interstate 5 and the Port of Stockton. And so I wanted to show that to be able to talk about what heat island effect is and the impact that it can have on making extreme heat feel much more severe in low-income communities of color that have been disinvested. And so with heat island effect, what it is where the lack of green spaces and having a lot of concrete and impervious surfaces or dark surfaces will absorb the heat and radiate it back. And because of that, where the temperature in the example I gave was 102, the actual felt temperature can be much more higher, like probably like 105 and 100 or 106. Whereas other parts of Stockton can feel a lot cooler because of the impacts of having a lot of trees present in the neighborhood. And so there's an equity issue with extreme heat where the impacts are going to be felt much more severely in low-income neighborhoods where there aren't this green infrastructure. And just with looking at the projection of that year that happened to me in 1999, there were only 11 days of extreme heat. And looking at the year 2020, there's now 31 days, just showing how this extreme heat issue is growing exponentially in the Central Valley. And the equity issue is not just about the heat island effect. And for this, I really want to talk about the example of the Chicago heat wave. If you haven't heard of it before, it took place in the year 1995, and the heat wave lasted a total of 5 days. But just in those 5 days, there were over 700 deaths because of the extreme heat. And really, that's a tragedy because heat-related deaths are completely preventable. So some of the factors that led to this, Chicago is really hot, but as mentioned with the extreme heat, being in a place with a lot of concrete, having a lot of tall buildings, just really traps that heat and exacerbates it. Chicago is also a more humid climate than it is in California. And Dr. Partida mentioned the heat index, which is the way like humidity and other factors can actually make the heat feel. And on that first day, it was 106 degrees, but the heat index was actually over 120 degrees. Chicago has a lot of old housing stock in low-income neighborhoods, so a lot of places that aren't equipped with air conditioning. And even with the access to air conditioning, the energy use was so high that power grids quickly failed. At one point, over 49,000 homes had no electricity. And then the majority of deaths from this heat wave were elderly folks because they were socially isolated and living in neighborhoods where living alone, they had concerns over crime and didn't feel safe to open their windows at night to deadly effects. And I know in neighborhoods of poverty, that can be an issue too when you're thinking of other social vulnerabilities and how that interplays with this extreme heat issue. And if you wanted to learn more about this heat wave, a really documentary I would recommend is called Cooked: Survival by Zip Code, which you can view on at least Amazon Prime. So Little Manila Rising, a big part of our programs is engaging with young people and residents to really try to have them understand these different vulnerabilities and be able to raise awareness. Actually, our youth advocates a few months ago helped put on a virtual screening of the documentary I mentioned. And also last year, we teamed up with the Delta Stewardship Council. They just released a climate vulnerability assessment. And so we partnered with them to have our youth read through the extreme heat findings and put their own reactions on what they were concerned about. And so some of the things on the slide were the different points that they mentioned that they were worried about or had their own personal experiences with, including heat-related or health-related things like allergy flare-ups, where with extreme heat, the plants can pollinate sooner, and so that allergy season is longer, dehydration, heat stroke, respiratory problems. In the Central Valley, there's already high rates of asthma, as well as a lot of impacts to people that are outdoors, such as farm workers, people who use public transit, unhoused populations, and just some of the mental health impacts that we kind of can understand after the isolation of COVID. So I don't really have time to go into all the different things that they mentioned, but just wanted to focus on a few. The first with air quality. First, we should understand the Central Valley has a really high burden of air quality. There's, you can look up the California EnviroScreen Index, which measures pollution burden across all of California. And when you look at just the full map, it really lights up the Central Valley as the reddest on pollution burden and just air quality impacts. And with pollution and extreme heat, there's an interaction effect where the primary pollutants, such as nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds, mix in with the sunlight to cause ozone and smog. And it can be kind of a cyclical effect where extreme heat, you're going to use your AC in your cars more, and that's going to emit more of this primary pollutants, which is then going to produce more ozone. Second, water quality. So this is a picture in downtown Stockton of like the port and the water that kind of comes from the Delta. It doesn't really look much like water. You can see all the green, and what that is toxic algal blooms. And that's when colonies of algae grow out of control. Just with the sunlight really helps grow, aids in the growth, and it produces toxic effects, including rash, hives, diarrhea, vomiting, coughing, and wheezing, and severe impacts can include impairing the liver and nervous system. And this is an issue because we've just seen over the last few years, these toxic algal blooms come in much earlier and grow just much denser. And it's also an issue because some people have fished in the water, swim in the water, and also the sensitive species that are part of the Delta. And this was mentioned already, drought. And so I guess the only additional point I'll add is just the Central Valley is a big pillar, not only the agricultural industry for our region, but for the state and the nation. And with drought, that just really is going to have a large economic impact locally and statewide, and also just accelerate things like wildfires or just drinking water supply. And then on electricity and energy impact, in the Chicago heat wave example, we saw how cooling was vitally important to ensure people were able to survive through the heat wave. And in communities of poverty, like a lot of Stockton, and I'm sure a lot of parts of the Central Valley as well, it can be an issue without having air conditioning, or also people not wanting to pay, or just the high energy bill burden from paying, and plus the risk of overwhelming the system and having energy shutoffs. And there's been a few reports that identify Stockton and other parts of the Central Valley as having really high rates of energy debt or energy arrearments, which can be a growing concern as we get more extreme heat days. So just kind of to shift gears and maybe end on a little bit more of a positive note, I wanted to talk about some of the efforts we have at Little Manila Rising and in Stockton to kind of address extreme heat. So the first is we are a transformative climate communities city. We just started this in 2020. And with that, some of the projects include home weatherization with Rising Sun Center for Energy, where they're going into people's homes and being able to swap out their home appliances, like toilets, shower heads, dishwashers, light bulbs, all for free. We have Grid Alternatives, which are also supplying free solar roofs. And then at Little Manila Rising, what we're doing is planting 650 trees through South Stockton, homes and parks, which can really help with the heat island effect. When I was watching the Cook documentary, they had an interesting point where they said one mature tree that's planted can have the cooling effect of 12 room-size air conditioners. So really just the value of planting trees and increasing that green cover that can have on the community. The second is Stockton is also an AB 617 community, which is a statewide effort to address air pollution in environmentally justice impacted communities through setting enforcement measures on polluters, as well as creating community incentives towards cleaning the air. And at Little Manila, we're doing an effort called Stockton Skywatch, where we have set up community air monitoring systems that can measure pollution burden, but also the temperature to really target where the areas that it's most impacted. And I guess the last point I'll say is we are located in a part of South Stockton where there aren't really access to cooling centers. So we're trying to now explore the ways on how to create a climate resiliency center that can provide that cooling off center, but also be able to put a solar energy grid that can hopefully supply our center as well as the surrounding neighborhood in case of an energy shutoff. So I'll kind of end there, just on slides on how you can learn about the work of Little Manila or contact me. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene and Pablo. I find it interesting, Irene, that several of the things you talked about towards the end were things people were raising during the chat. So, you know, like tree planting and cooling centers. We'll talk more about those in a moment. We do have time for a couple of questions before we turn to Elizabeth and Kimberly. Pablo, I'd like to start with you. One of the questions that came up, and I don't know how much your research focuses on this, but perhaps you can comment. When we're talking about the Central Valley, of course, we're talking a lot about agriculture. We're going to be hearing from someone on behalf of the farm workers, but what about the food itself? What do you think the impact of heat is going to be on California agriculture? Are there ways we can mitigate those impacts or adapt to the impacts of the carbon we've already put in the atmosphere? Is California's status as a provider of food for the world at risk? And if so, what can we be doing about that?
Yes, probably many people know that California produces 2/3 of California, nuts and vegetables, and like 1/3 of the fruits that are sold in the United States. So it's definitely the most important agricultural region in the country. And what needs to happen is I don't see people leaving the valley. No, this is a super important land. What I see happening is having enough pressure to start managing groundwater resources and surface water resources more sustainably. And then rather than focusing the whole valley economy only in agriculture, like start bringing other opportunities for the most disadvantaged communities. We have some research going on how this could start to be done. And it's basically proposing some buffer areas because many of the disadvantaged communities are surrounded by agriculture. So it's how can we integrate the value of that land, integrate farmers, integrate farm workers on envisioning new communities surrounded by, instead of agriculture for a certain radius, with different socioeconomic opportunities that can support the community. And this could be seen as parks, this could be seen as markets, this could be seen as areas with solar panels that may produce energy not only for that community, but maybe for other communities surrounding, and just kind of be creative and bring many people on board to create the new communities that we want to see in this state. So it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of resources, and a lot of what we are calling now in the coal industry and in many other fuel, fossil fuel related industry like a just transition. And this will be kind of a just transition for many of the farm workers communities, because there is definitely some jobs that will be lost in agriculture as we transition towards a more sustainable agriculture future in California. And it's how can we bring many of those farm workers to learn different skills, because many of the skills that they have are transferable to other socioeconomic opportunities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I will also mention that the Climate Center is working on a bill, AB 2649, nature-based carbon sequestration, that is going to set targets to help farmers and other managers of natural lands lock carbon into the soil. We'll drop a link in that in just a moment. But it's the people, it's the communities, it's the land, it's all of it, as you point out, Pablo. Irene, I'd like to turn to a couple of questions for you. One, very straightforward. You mentioned a documentary in your presentation. A couple of people wanted a reminder of what that documentary is.
Yeah, it's called Cooked: Survival by Zip Code. I'll put it in the chat.
Great. So we're going to put a link in the chat. So appreciate that. Now, you talked about the tree planting and you talked about the cooling centers, both of which we got a couple of follow-up questions on. The trees that you're planting, are they on private land? How does that work? Some people might be looking to replicate that program. Who maintains the trees and makes sure that they survive and thrive? Obviously, tree planting is just the first step. So can you talk a little bit more about how that whole process works in your community?
Yeah, definitely. And just a little context too, that a lot of, I think back in 2016, there were a lot of community organizations that were getting access to free trees through just PG&E programs, as well as a lot of statewide programs. And when it got to the point of going to the city to ask for permission to plant on the street, there was a lot of no's and just kind of walls at that point, because I don't know if this is the case in a lot of cities, but in the case of the city of Stockton, they almost had a moratorium on planting new trees because of that high concern about the maintenance. And then later on, when we got transformative climate communities, that does have that aspect of tree planting. And I guess just being fortunate that there's been so many opportunities now for urban forestry and tree planting grants at the statewide level, and a change in some of the city leadership to be more accepting or willing to take it on. So yeah, I guess in the example of transformative climate communities, it does work in the cost of maintaining the trees as well for up to 3 years. And I think another challenge that sometimes you'll face in Central Valley or in low-income communities is that the way the sidewalks are built, the tree wells there might not be large enough to be the qualified area to be able to plant a tree to the CAL FIRE specification. And so we've also had to look into ways to get funding to be able to cut up the concrete to force an area large enough to be able to put in trees. But yeah, for our planting program, we are focusing on the street tree wells, parks, schools, and in people's homes, where we'll plant them in the front. So it's still accessible for the city when they do take on the obligation of the trees in the end to be able to drive by and see them.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for more details on that. I think that's something a lot of people are interested in. We do just have another couple of minutes. Pablo, Dr. Partida, we had a couple questions about high incidence of asthma, right? I mean, we know that asthma is, and I know this is not necessarily your specific area of expertise, but is there evidence that the high incidence of asthma is caused by or exacerbated by extreme heat? What about, you talked about health effects. What are some of the sort of positive feedback loops that we need to try and break?
Yeah, as you say, it's not my area. What I have read lately in some of the research is that the relationship is not linear. That means that it doesn't mean that for every degree you will see a relatively similar increase on hospitalizations due to asthma. What I have read is that relationship is not linear. Is not only related to temperature, it's also related to air pollution, humidity, and extreme heat seems to have some component on that, particularly as usual, in adults and in young children.
Right. Well, thank you very much for that. I really appreciate both of your thoughtful comments. We do need to move on to our next speakers now. Stick around. Maybe we'll have time for a couple of additional questions at the end. But I do want to thank you both very much for not only what you presented here today, but more importantly for what you do every day in your communities and on behalf of the state of California and our climate and people. I do want to mention one other thing before I turn to Elizabeth. I want to let everyone on this call know that we are currently recruiting a Central Valley community organizer. So the Climate Center does have a job announcement out right now and an opportunity. If you think this is something you want to be more engaged with, please, I'm going to ask my colleague Barry to drop a link in the chat, and you can check out that job announcement, share it widely with your various networks. So thank you for that. And thank you for those of you who have endorsed Climate Safe California. I encourage you to do so if you haven't done so yet. Let's now turn to the impacts of heat on farm workers. And in order to talk about this, we're very happy that Elizabeth Strader of the United Farm Workers is here with us today. Elizabeth, what can you tell us about the impact on the people who actually work in the fields and processing facilities and feed us every day?
Sure thing. Thanks for having us here, having this really important conversation today. I think a lot of what you're going to hear about how heat impacts farm workers is in some ways an echo or mirrored in some of the comments that Irene had to say about how some of the people that are vulnerable to all sorts of things and have a thinner safety net are going to be more vulnerable to heat as well, because sort of none of these conditions affects people directly in a vacuum. We know a lot about the effects of, I'm really sorry, there's just so many cats in this house. We've got some kittens, kitten season. There's a lot of ways that, we know a lot about the ways that heat affects the human body. We know a lot of ways about some of the pretty simple preventative measures that we can take when workers are out working in high ambient heat. Some of the earlier effects, the symptoms that you're going to have are, one of the earlier symptoms is going to be your cognitive processes go down. So not only is heat dangerous for farm workers in and of itself, it also makes them more vulnerable to errors, to pesticide handling errors, to musculoskeletal injuries, to falls, to cuts, all these kinds of things. So it is just one risk factor in a really grueling job. And we do know there's plenty of data that shows that farm workers are somewhere between 20 and 35 times more likely to be killed by heat than any other civilian worker. There's a number of reasons for that. Some of those reasons are that they are working in both social and sometimes geographical isolation, where it's difficult for them to have the information, the training, the access to protections that they need. There's also a component of once they are very ill, they may not be able to reach emergency medical treatment in time. That's one reason. Another, there's all sorts of reasons. You're also going to have, a landscaper or a construction worker is also going to be working in high ambient temperatures. These aren't necessarily people that are living a really privileged life either. But the reason that farm workers are going to be disproportionately affected by high temperatures is because of things like piece rate, which is a farm worker is paid by the pound or by the bin. They're paid by the amount that they produce, which doesn't vary in the heat for the most part. And so they have a perverse financial incentive to push their body beyond what it's meant to endure. They don't have the opportunity to take a break, to slow down their work without having a financial penalty on them. So these are the kinds of things that add up to farm workers being disproportionately affected by heat. In a number of states, and we've done a lot of work around this year, in the past 2-3 years, California heat protection rules for California workers, which is the enforceable rules from a health and safety agency. So there's these workplace protection rules in California. We've worked very hard to bring rules that are coming closer into alignment with the California rules in Oregon and Washington. We're sort of taking a Western states holistic view at some of those state protections at the state level. And one thing that's really encouraging in an impatient way is that after years, maybe decades of petitioning and working really hard to get us to this point, at the federal level, we still have there are no heat protections for outdoor workers in the United States at the federal level. But we do have, at this point, OSHA has entered into the public rulemaking process, which is great. We are going to have, just announced in September of last year that we're going to have heat rules at the federal level for the first time, which is fantastic news. That being said, that's on average, a new rule from OSHA takes about 8 years. So we're hoping to see some emergency action and see things moving a little more quickly. We're also working at the state and local level to make sure that there are some robust protections in place. And the rules do work. Heat protection rules do work. We know that not only in areas with reasonable heat protection standards, we know that farm workers are less likely to die of heat, that are less likely to be hospitalized with heat illness. But there's more subtle changes too, that rates in the farm worker communities, rates of chronic kidney disease also go down. Because you think about the way that the heat is affecting, your human, all of your different systems. You think about the way that chronic dehydration affects the kidneys, and you're able to take a step back once you have these holistic rules and sort of look at the bigger picture there. And then I think that there was an interest. It's really just something to think about. There was an interesting phenomenon that I think happened last summer during the heat dome in the extreme temperatures that we saw, particularly affecting the Pacific Northwest. If you're familiar with Washington and Oregon, I've spent a lot of time in Washington State looking at these things. As you go east of the mountains, away from the coast, it's kind of a high desert. It's a high agriculture area. That's where the majority of Washington agricultural work is done, and it's often very hot in the summer. On the west side of the mountains, of course, is Portland, Olympia, Seattle. These places that we are always think of these sort of cool, foggy climates. And what happened during that heat dome is that west of the mountains in Portland and Seattle and Olympia, folks experienced 110, 112 degrees for the first time in their lives. And so we know that a heat dome like that was a mass casualty event. And, that's certainly, something that is very haunting and happens every year, but it was an especially haunting year. But what it also was a mass empathy event, where I really think that some of these folks in these milder regions that had previously both their class status and their geographic location had protected them from the realities of climate change to a point. And I think that was very sobering, and it will be interesting to me to see as folks that did not used to be affected by some of these more severe conditions are gonna find that they have a little more empathy and a little more mobilization around those folks that have been at the front lines of climate change for years. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate that. I'm going to hold off on the questions for just a moment because I'd like to bring Kimberly Wormsley into the conversation, and then we'll have some questions for you both. I do encourage everyone to keep those questions coming. And Elizabeth, we will get back to you and give you an opportunity to address some of the questions that are coming in. Before we do that, though, I'd like to invite Councilmember Wormsley to join us. Kimberly represents the city of Stockton on the city council. Thank you so much for being here, council member. I'd love to hear a little bit more of your thoughts about what your community is doing and focusing on solutions, and anything else you'd like to share with our audience here today.
For sure, and thank you for this invitation. I think for my segment, I felt that it was most appropriate for me to talk about how elected officials such as myself can implement and ensure policies surrounding resource and resources and plans protecting our most vulnerable communities during heat waves can occur. So as we all know in this call, many cities and counties, such as Stockton, have received ARPA and CARES money to combat COVID-19. So there's money on the table, and we need to work to ensure that vulnerable communities are protected and that they are coordinated and intentional collaboration efforts on all levels of government, school, and community partnerships who already have the trust in the community is taking place. So first and foremost, I'm talking about an awareness and educational campaign. I think that many citizens do not understand the consequences that can happen during a heat wave, from the proper setting of your temperature to staying hydrated, and even what to do when temperatures peak during the day. So this campaign, and similar to the work that Irene does at Little Manila, to our local churches, who, like I said earlier, have the trusted relationship. So providing this direct information to citizens and residents, and of course, really elevating our most vulnerable communities. Also, with all of the COVID work, we've seen this great massive amount of champions and community-based partners who are going out, going door to door to provide that information, not only for the educational piece, but what are some supportive services that are out there. Here in San Joaquin County, I'm pretty sure that many other counties also have 24/7 informational lines like 211 that's available, that should always have this pertinent information available to them, so that when residents do call to inquire about cooling centers and facilities or churches that are made available for cooling opportunities, especially in our most vulnerable communities, that they are accessible. And then also making sure that our offices of emergency services has a plan to combat heat insecurities, and we are not scrambling. I think, again, COVID-19 has really opened our eyes in regards to making sure that these emergency systems are put in place. I also want to elevate other policy work that's taken place in terms of our infrastructure and maintenance. And I think that other cities and counties should, do the same sentiment, making sure that we're using heat-resistant surfacing materials and investing in green spaces, and making sure that our parks are beautified and have, the appropriate trees and shades and cooling spots for our young people. Also, I think that as elected officials and local policy influencers, we have to work to ensure that PG&E and our local water agencies are accountable and responsible to the people. Every decision and choices that our local elected officials should make as it relates to our vulnerable communities, as it relates to climate efforts, as it relates to preserving the integrity of our people, should be trauma-informed, compassionate, and realistic, because we do have to acknowledge the historical misinvestment and disinvestment and who has paid the consequences of that, which are people of color, which are people in our most underdeveloped or undeveloped communities. I also want to amplify the fact that as a councilwoman for the city of Stockton, I advocate wholeheartedly for climate justice and reform. I think, again, this has to happen on all levels of government. And a few weeks ago, which I'm really embarrassed to say, but I'm not going to be accountable for the actions that happened 50 years ago. I am going to be accountable for the actions of today, and that's language justice. So ensuring that Stocktonians, many of whose primary language is Spanish, we need to make sure that proper translation is happening on the local level, and making sure that our offices of emergency services are providing information to the community in a multilingual perspective, so that we're not subsequently leaving out a particular community or group because they cannot understand the information that is being designated into the airway. I do want to kind of close by saying my favorite quote. It is from the Honorable Martin Luther King. He once eloquently stated that no one is free until we all are free. When any one of us on this call, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in this world is oppressed, the injustice diminishes us all. And so as we work to move forward to ensure that policies reflect the priorities of the people, as we move forward to ensure that policies reflect the priorities of the people, as we reflect on the policies and injustices that have been consequential because elected officials and leaders did not prioritize our most precious assets in this world, which are people, we are all oppressed. So I know I went pretty fast. I wanted to make sure that I got all my talking points in there, but I appreciate you all.
Well, thank you, Councilmember Wormsley. We really appreciate it. I want to bring Elizabeth back into the conversation, but first, Kimberly, I'd like to ask you a question. You're talking about people, and I want to pull on a question that came in a little bit earlier, because all people includes those people who we often overlook. Are there any organizations centering climate justice initiatives or anyone working in your community to help the unsheltered community in the Central Valley? The unhoused and the unsheltered are often highly vulnerable to these types of extreme heat events. What's going on in Stockton in that regard? We'd love to hear your thoughts about that community also.
For sure, and I agree. I think that right now, the unsheltered communities are being elevated on all levels, from COVID reform to climate justice, to ensure that when we are mitigating unsheltered community, we are providing them those resources. So making sure that 211 is always involved. We consistently ensure that our shelters are properly serving our unhoused communities, making sure that they are opening their doors to ensure that the unsheltered are receiving those cooling aspects, water, and they're not just being put out at 7 a.m. and being told to go out into the community and not have access. We are also ensuring that our libraries are opened more earlier in the day. And that we do have a cooling park located downtown Stockton. So we're making sure that that's also opened, working with our senior citizen community centers to make sure that they're open and having longer hours as well. And like I said, making sure that that information is being disseminated into the community, using our church, our faith-based leaders in churches also who have closer ties to that community, and of course making sure that our nonprofits also working alongside of us as a city.
Thank you. And I'm sure some of those same efforts are being echoed in other communities up and down the Central Valley and throughout the state of California, where compassion is our calling card. Elizabeth, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation. Well, let's continue talking about people. We had a number of questions regarding the farm workers. I want to kind of combine them and let you address them in a more extensive way. Somebody asked about data on the number of farm workers that suffer from heat stroke and death. And I don't know if you have access to data or information on that, but as you address that, there's two other questions I want to kind of put into the mix. How are the landowners and the large industrial farmers caring for their workers? Do they provide heat remediation tools? And also, somebody pointed out that some growers exploit loopholes by ducking enforcement and hiding behind contracts with contractors so that they're not responsible, and you can kind of have a shell game going on there. What steps should be taken to close those loopholes? So again, what kind of data is there? What are farmers supposed to be providing? And how do we close the loopholes to make sure that that really happens?
Yeah. The Union of Concerned Scientists put out a really good report last year that has the most substantive data that I've seen in recent years. I can pull that up and find the link in a moment. But it's the rates of workers that experience heat illness, heat injury, or death from heat at work is undercounted. In many, even as simple as taking state data and looking at the OSHA, severe injury or fatality rates, and then comparing them to workers' compensation claims that were found to be valid for heat. Very rarely you see the numbers that sort of add up in any state, and that includes California. So they're not necessarily, the employer's not reporting a workplace incident, but at the same time, these are workers who then are going on to have successful workers' compensation claims. And, again, that is going to be a hugely underreported number. 75%, give or take, of the farm workers in California are undocumented. And so this is a group of folks that is pretty reticent to engage in all of the different processes that really give us our data with a lot of transparency. So these are very sort of invisible folks. These are folks that are by nature in the shadows, and in the shadows in a heat conversation has a little bit of irony to it. Heat illness and death in farm workers is for the most part entirely preventable. It's preventable through some fairly basic steps. You need to have adequate shade, and in California we do have a lot of language defining what shade is, and I could define shade in 600 words or more, but and I do when we're working in rulemaking sessions, but having access to adequate shade, having adequate access to suitably cool potable drinking water, having shade, rest, and water are the three most important things. Rest is very important. They need to have a paid system so that when it is very hot and workers are earning piece rate wages, there needs to be a paid rest break for them to allow the other factors, cold water, shade, and have a position of rest such that they can even take stock of the symptoms they may be experiencing. Acclimatization is very important. We know that if a worker is coming from a different region into, a very hot part of California, we know that the first 14 days that they're doing that work, or the first 14 days of those higher temperatures, are very dangerous. Acclimatization, workers that are not acclimated to those working conditions are the most vulnerable. So, we need the shade, we need the rest, we need the water. We also need the training and the information and the supervision. So a worker who is not acclimatized, or any worker when it's 105, 110, 118 degrees, there should be a buddy system as well. Because again, we think about when your body is trying to cool itself so desperately, so much of your blood volume is rushed to the surface of your skin in the hopes that your sweating process can cool you, that is where you begin to have cognitive decline. there's, your other organs are robbed of blood as well, but you start to make poor decisions once you're in that danger zone. And so the knowledge, the rest, the shade, the water, and of course you need to have an employer that's taking these things seriously and making sure that everyone from the farm labor contractor and the supervisors and your other workers are taking care of someone who who may be in trouble and realize it far too late. And when you think about the sort of that fractured workplace model or that fissured workplace model, where the grower, which is the landowner, has one position, and then increasingly now you see it a ton. There may actually be no shared language between the grower and the workers, and they are relying on the good faith trust that they place in their farm labor contractors to ensure that the bare basics are being provided. And when we talk about bare basics, when we talk about rulemaking, California was a huge leader in terms of heat rules. Now there are other states now that have stronger heat rules than California, incrementally. But when we go about this rulemaking process, and really when we made the successful push in California, we were basing the target rules on what the United States military had determined was necessary to keep soldiers alive in a combat situation. So we're not talking about comfortable. We're talking about the real basics to save lives, to prevent brain damage, to prevent kidney damage, or at least reduce the rates of those things. So there really are harsh conditions. There really is a tremendous amount of, one could say, trust on the growers' parts when it comes to their farm labor contractors. That you could also say that there is a willingness to, say, well, I didn't know. I told them to do it this way. But increasingly, you do see state, the state labor in Washington State would be Labor and Industries, in California would be Cal OSHA, and you are seeing more momentum around holding joint employers responsible, which means not just holding the farm labor contractors responsible, the grower is responsible. Similarly, we're seeing an increased interest in especially in the Western states and in New York, but in California, you see a lot of emphasis around that in warehouse workers as well. So any of these workers, Amazon fulfillment centers, you think about the folks that are delivering packages, and understanding that having that that subcontracted labor in California is not a get out of jail free pass here, in terms of if you're violating those your basic general obligation to provide a safe working conditions. You are starting to we are starting to see more folks hold folks accountable all the way up that line, and you can't just subcontract your way out of your obligations.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for addressing that and in such details. We're talking a lot about sort of like adaptation to the crisis. There's a lot of questions in the chat about like, well, how do we reverse the crisis? How do we get out of the crisis? And that's going to take longer term efforts by organized labor, by nonprofits like us, by our many business partners and others who are part of this Climate Safe California Coalition. I have one more question for you, Council Member Wormsley, and I'd like to bring the other speakers back right after you answer this question for any kind of closing thoughts before we have an action item for everybody to take before we send you all home today. But Council Member Wormsley, someone said, thank you for opening the libraries early. Do you think it's a good idea for the state? In fact, let's focus on Stockton, since that's who you represent. Should Stockton be putting solar plus storage on all the libraries, on all the senior centers? Should that be happening throughout California? And if so, what assistance does Stockton need to make that happen? Oh,
where the money resides. Y'all hear that? Ever heard that phrase, where the money resides? I think that it's a great opportunity. I know that. So twofold, because I talked about the ARP money and the CARES money which has given cities and counties a lot of flexibility because we're able to do things with our budget that ordinarily we would not be able to do. And so I think that, again, the pandemic has taught us so much of what we should have been doing. And when I think about the conversation about putting solar panels on our libraries, our community centers, we actually began putting Wi-Fi towers on our community centers and our libraries because there was such a surge of young people and students and even professionals who were dependent on the internet. And when all that stuff was crashing across the state, people were looking for Wi-Fi. And so I think that we need to reimagine how we are building out our infrastructure for decades to come. We need to be innovative. We need to invest in green opportunities and vessels. I know that the Port of Stockton, because we just came back from One Voice. So we just came back from DC advocating for infrastructure dollars. And so I think that this is a great conversation. And I think that moving forward, I'm going to add it to my list of advocacy when we go see our state officials and our federal officials. But I think that that's a great step in moving forward because, you know, let's be honest too, I'm gonna be very clear and very intentional of what I'm about to say. I'm a single mom. And I am out here working hard, and it's even hard for me to keep up with the high cost of electricity and making sure that my household is thriving and my kids are taken care of. So we will be visiting some of these libraries in the very near future. So I get it, I really do. And I think that that is a step in the right direction so that we have no excuses to open our doors for our vulnerable communities and people like myself who are just maintaining because inflation is real.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you for bringing the personal into this also. It's important, I think, for us all to remember we are all individuals. We have families. This is all very, very real and on the ground. I would like to mention that the Climate Center has authored a bill specifically to help communities with community energy resilience. It's SB 833, authored by Senator Dodd. It is moving through the Senate and I believe headed off to the Assembly. I'm going to ask SB 833, that's correct. I'm going to ask my colleague Barry to drop a link if you'd like to learn more. You can also sign on to support that bill, and that's going to help communities like Stockton and others throughout the state do exactly what we're talking about, which is put in more solar and storage and plan for those eventualities. Before we turn back to Mark for our action item today, I just wanted to kick it back around the room, starting with Pablo and then with Irene. Any kind of closing thoughts? We've got maybe about a minute each. You know, what more can people do? People asking about how to get high school students involved, what they can do in their communities, a lot of engagement. Pablo, we'll start with you. Any final thoughts?
Yes, thank you. And it's along the lines that I was saying, no, if you work in a school, then get informed about all these issues and then share them with your students. If you work in agriculture, then think about how you can protect your farm workers, or if you are a farm worker, then hopefully you have the trust with your employer to tell them about all of this. And I'm guessing they already know, but maybe pushing a little bit further. And for everyone else, just basically think about what your work is. And again, if your work is reducing the equity gap, if you are kind of reducing your emissions in wherever you are working on, and very importantly, not only thinking about what you can do as individual, or think about what you can do as individual to push for the bigger change. No, at this moment, we need the systemic change. We need policies, we need regulations, and we need people to put pressure to change that.
Well, thank you, Pablo, and thank you to the Union of Concerned Scientists for all the work you do, and thank you, Doctor, for being part of our presentation here today. Real briefly, I'd just like to kick it around the room for final thoughts, and I know we're a little past our agenda, but we'll get there. Don't worry, Mark, you'll be up after our speakers. Irene, any final thoughts from Little Manila Rising?
I mean, I definitely appreciated a lot of similar things as Councilmember Wormsley, and just really appreciate the comments about personal experience. And I think it's important, like, for people who have that direct lived experience of extreme heat or lack of AC to get leaders to understand that, whether they understand it themselves or be able to bring constituents to them to really talk about how big this problem is. And I think it's going to take a lot of partnership between nonprofits, education to residents, and even partnership with the business community to really figure out a solution to this problem, and creating coalitions like really targeted at looking at extreme heat as an issue, which I know right now we started to have coalitions just around climate resiliency efforts in general, but not anything yet specific on extreme heat. So yeah, just starting to work on things like that.
Thank you so much, Irene. Elizabeth, final thoughts on behalf of the United Farm Workers or from yourself as a caring human being?
Sure thing. I've just dropped in the chat our social media handles, the United Farm Workers social media accounts. You will find every single day, you'll see a worker, you'll hear their name. We often share the information around the temperature they're working in or the piece rate that they are being paid. It is a good way to humanize the work that is being done to keep food in your climate controlled kitchen. And it's a good way to have some really sobering thoughts about the folks that really are these human shields when it comes to the violence of the extremes of climate change. And we will frequently have calls to action. We're very policy focused right now. And there's a lot of opportunities. Once you've taken a few action steps and you've given us your zip code, we're going to be reaching out to you about things that are specific to your region. So feel free to reach out and tune in on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Much appreciated. Kimberly, any final thoughts from the city of Stockton or from your home office?
I just want to say that heating insecurities do not discriminate, and they are very real. And as I think that being the third largest economy in the world, that California should be at the forefront in supporting counties, cities, and our schools by any means necessary. So whatever you all need me to do in my wheelhouse, I stay ready. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. And I'd like to make sure that everybody knows this is not just about listening, it's also about doing. We do have some actions for you to take. We've been dropping them in the link, but I'd like to bring my colleague Mark Victoria back to share with you something that you can do right now to help address the issue. Go ahead, Mark.
Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And ultimately what I'm going to just bring your attention to is if you guys go to theclimatecenter.org, which is our website, and you come over here to take action, scroll down, click on this link, and you'll be able to see a lot of the bills that we're working on. We already talked about, Duran mentioned our Community Energy Resilience Act bill, SB 833. We also talked about our Natural Carbon-Based Sequestration Resilience Act, AB 2649. And if you have not yet, please go ahead and click on this link here. I know the link was in the chat to endorse our Climate Safe California campaign. But in particular to heat, AB 2076, which is right here, if we go ahead and put that link or click on that link there. This bill passed the Assembly floor last week and is headed to the Senate. This bill requires the Department of Public Health to establish and maintain the extreme heat and health reporting system to assist with local interventions and to identify and protect heat vulnerable populations. The bill also establishes the Extreme Heat and Community Resilience Program that will coordinate state efforts and support local and regional efforts to prevent or mitigate the public health risks of extreme heat. So if you just go ahead and go ahead and come to this page here, it'll give you a little bit of a background of what the bill is doing. If you put in your information here, as I have mine, and go ahead and just come down and click down on take action, it will go ahead and send an email over to your senator, who will be voting on that bill as soon as the Senate Rules Committee will, move it along in their policy committees. Critical that we let our legislators know that this is an important issue for us. And again, I just wanted to say thank you for everybody for attending our webinar, and thank you to the speakers and presenters.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. And thank you all, Kimberly Wormsley, Dr. Jose Partida, Irene Kalimlim, Elizabeth Strader. You guys all provided great information. There was active conversation in the chat and the Q&A. I want to thank all of the almost 100 people who showed up here today to listen to this important issue and remind us extreme heat is the symptom. So we have to deal with the symptoms, but also address the root causes. And that's what some of these bills are intended to do. The Climate Center is very proud to work in coalition with the farm workers, with elected officials, with the Union of Concerned Scientists, Little Manila Rising, and environmental justice groups throughout the state in order to push for climate safe California. We do have a couple of minutes left, but I want to gift you all those couple of minutes back to your day. And I want to thank every one of you, not only for being here today and providing such great information and great questions, whether you're an attendee or whether you're a presenter. I want to particularly thank you for everything you do every day to help people and the planet here in our beautiful state of California. So thank you all for coming. Remember, we've got another webinar on building electrification next week. You can sign up for that on our website, as well as all the other information. I really, really appreciate all of you. And I want to thank you all for being here and wish you all a wonderful and hopefully cool day. Thank you all very much. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah.